Welcome to Voice for Infection Prevention, where we explore the latest developments, challenges, and insights in the field of infection prevention and control. With a passion for promoting patient safety and healthcare excellence, we're excited to bring you engaging discussions with experts, leaders, and innovators in the field. So whether you're a seasoned professional or just beginning your journey in infection prevention, welcome to the conversation. This is Voice for Infection Prevention.
Welcome back to Voice for Infection Prevention. Today I'm joined by Lerenza Howard, an infection prevention leader whose career journey brings such a thoughtful and encouraging perspective to the field. Lerenza came into infection prevention from a microbiology background, and her story is a great example of how valuable non-nursing pathways can be in this profession. From clinical laboratory work to starting her infection prevention career in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, her path reflects both the complexity of the role and level of resilience, curiosity, and critical thinking it takes to grow in it. In this conversation, Lerenza shares what it was like to enter infection prevention during one of the most intense seasons healthcare has faced, how she built confidence as a non-nurse in a field that has historically leaned heavily toward nursing backgrounds, and what helped her develop the clinical knowledge, leadership skills, and professional presence needed to succeed. We also talk about certification, mentorship, APIC involvement, career advancement, and why relationship building and continuous learning are so essential in this work. If you're interested in non-traditional paths into infection prevention, leadership growth, and practical encouragement for both new and aspiring IPs, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. Let's dive in. So let's start off. We're going to do the same kind of start that I do with all of these interviews now, because it always gives us kind of a good perspective on where things are. But I'm curious how you ended up in infection prevention. I mean, I talk to a lot of people now. It sounds like most people kind of fell into the industry. That seems to be a common phrase, or they didn't know about it until kind of later on in their career. But I'm curious, how did you start your infection prevention career?
So I started my infection prevention career. I will start by noting, how did I even become aware of the field of infection prevention? So my background is in microbiology, both non-clinical, and then I transitioned to clinical microbiology, working for a health system here in Chicago. And during my onboarding, there was actually an infection preventionist that convened with the onboarding to teach us about transmission-based precautions, and we went through the exercise of donning PPE with the use of glow germ to show us, how cross-transmission occurs if you're not appropriately donning and doffing and practicing appropriate hand hygiene practices. And that really sparked my interest in the position initially. And when I started, progressed within my role of clinical microbiology as a medical technologist, I then learned that my profession was a pathway actually into the field of infection prevention. So that really sparked my interest as my next step within my professional growth and advancement was to subsequently pursue a role in infection prevention. So I completed my role as a medical technologist in a microbiology lab, and I transitioned to a flow lab, which facilitated solid organ transplants, and learned that from the immunology standpoint. And then, but during that time, I attained my master's in healthcare administration, and I felt like it was the time for me to begin to pursue roles within infection prevention. And I subsequently obtained a role here at a health system in Chicago as an infection preventionist, and that's how I started my career.
Okay. So it looks like, you spent about 6 years as a medical technologist before you broke into a true infection prevention field. And it looks like you even started, now did you start in a hospital, or did you have a few microbiology jobs before you actually got into healthcare?
Absolutely. So I did start my my career as a microbiologist in a non-clinical laboratory. I initially started in a food laboratory. So if you've seen news clips of Listeria outbreaks or other outbreaks related to foodborne illnesses, it was labs such as the one that I worked in as a microbiologist that facilitated the reporting of those outbreaks. We major brands of foods, testing those. I also worked in a radioactive pharmaceutical lab for a major organization, an organization that manufactured the dyes that go into patients, that are injected into patients for their scans. So that was a very interesting role to technically be a radioactive worker.
So then your first experience then, as far as the infection preventionist kind of coming up to you and talking with you, that was in the hospital, correct?
Absolutely. So I, from working in a radioactive pharmaceutical, for a radioactive pharmaceutical organization, I thought it would be best for me to transition into truly healthcare. That's more so working on the outskirts of healthcare and providing the testing the pharmaceuticals that are subsequently shipped to respective organizations. But I then secured a role as a medical technologist in a clinical microbiology laboratory. So that really gave me a sense of the healthcare environment and how things function, and also gave me the foundational knowledge as an IP by working in the lab and facilitating those results for patients.
So tell me this. I mean, obviously there's still way too many hospitals that require a nurse for infection prevention, and we can get into that and kind of what the challenges are there. But I'm curious, from you coming as a medical technologist, how smooth was that transition for you to a true infection prevention role?
So the utilizing the word smooth as far as the transition is kind of funny in retrospect, as far as me transitioning from a medical technologist working in a flow lab facilitating a solid organ transplant to securing a role as an infection preventionist. Why? Because I started during the pandemic. And what funner time to start within the field of infection prevention than, the COVID-19 pandemic. However, I wouldn't change it for the world, because really one way that I describe it to people is that I really had to learn a lot within a short time frame. I didn't have, necessarily the convenience to, of course, I had onboarding. However, we are managing and trying to battle a global pandemic with ever-changing guidance, quelling, attempting to quell concerns related to all that's going on, but then also the personal aspect of, navigating a global pandemic within our lives. So when I transitioned into that role, prior to transitioning into the role of infection prevention, the pandemic initially, we got our first case and initially, spread when I was a medical technologist working in a lab. So just dealing with some of the challenges that we had to face related to that. But then transitioning into IP, it really, critical thinking skills was something that, it was necessary to absolutely have critical thinking skills. And in being new, practicing good judgment and knowing and deferring questions to my leadership and or heavily researching to ensure that I'm providing adequate responses. And sometimes I needed to provide swift responses. So it really, I was, thrown into the profession to learn how to critically think, to convene with those literature reviews and utilize and leverage the infection prevention and control resources and literature that's out there to ensure that I'm appropriately providing the guidance needed to mitigate that. That in addition to some of the normal workflows of infection prevention as well.
Yeah, so I've got a few questions now, because starting an infection prevention career during COVID, and yeah, you were right in the thick of it. It looks like when you started. So I've got a lot of questions there. So let's start here. I guess when you moved into this role, was there any point a few weeks in or a few days in where you were like, what in the world did I get myself into?
So when I transitioned into the role of IP during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was really, it was like an adrenaline rush. Like literally in retrospect, some aspects I honestly don't remember because you're so in the moment in trying to solve whatever problem that is there before you while trying to understand and learn the some of the tasks, the normal tasks of an infection preventionist while trying to learn also how to be effective and efficient at your job and build those relationships, the multidisciplinary relationships as well. Yeah, so there were multiple skills that I had to utilize and leverage within a very, very short period of time while transitioning into the field of IP. But like I noted, I wouldn't have changed it for anything. I had no apprehensions or reconsiderations as it relates to my entry into the field of IP because of the global pandemic. If anything, there were challenges, yes. However, it was a daily learning experience, and I'm a learner, a habitual learner.
So, I mean, everybody always talks about how overwhelming it is when they get in the role, and I can only imagine being in the thick of COVID at the time. But one thing that's interesting, I talked to a lot of people at the system level and leaders just talk about, they brought on new people, and the people that started that really training for an infection prevention role really started a couple years later because it was just COVID for a year and a half. So I'm curious, when you were kind of being onboarded and kind of growing as an infection prevention person, when did you feel like you grasped the whole of infection prevention and kind of understood your full role as opposed to just kind of a reactionary role to what was hitting us with COVID?
Yeah, I would say maybe by year 2, possibly, that I kind of grasped some of the aspects of our role because, of course, during COVID, we had to risk assess our responsibilities and pause some of the normal workflows within our profession. So, of course, entering into the profession and not completing certain tasks because they're on pause, and then later incorporating those things within my workflows. I think by year 2, I would say I had a handle, at least, or not a handle on my tasks, more so because, of course, there's vast knowledge base that is required for the profession, and just using the APIC competency model, there was still more that I needed to learn. But as far as what I knew, in culmination with what I needed to know in order to consistently transition into the expert realm of IP, I think that, by year 2, I would say I was kind of comfortable in what it was expected of me, what the role typically would look like potentially. But of course, that leaves an indelible mark on you when you start within in the field of IP during a global pandemic.
Yeah. And when you started working, and like I said, I don't know if it happened during COVID or if it happened for you after that kind of settled down, but were you ever hit with anything, any questions or any meetings you were called into where your kind of initial response was, oh, wow, I didn't realize that was in my purview, or I didn't realize that was my responsibility? Was there ever a moment where that hit, and what was that area?
Yeah, so one thing that I quickly had to learn, is how closely connected IPs are to executive leadership. Prior to coming into the role, there were many things that I didn't know. Of course, I tried to do my research prior to entering into the field of IP. However, in practice, it's very shocking how closely IPs work with executive leadership. So, of course, I had a director of an IP that I reported to. However, I matrix reported to the chief medical officer. So, engaged in meetings with executive leaders and other leaders within the healthcare organization. So starting my role within the organization during a global pandemic really opened my eyes to the brevity and the importance of my role, and also where, our positions lie within the hierarchical structure of a healthcare organization. I did not know that I would be in these meetings, with the C-suite, collaborating on making pertinent decisions about how, patients are managed, or patient throughput, or, even some decisions as it relates to some of the visitation, of course, that in some organizations paused. And it was definitely an eye-opening experience, especially with being a part of some not so easy decisions that had to be made just to ensure that there were appropriate public health mitigation strategies executed, and appropriate ITC practices executed within the healthcare organization to ensure everyone, patients, and staff were safe.
Especially when you're taking part in these meetings and kind of interacting with executives. Did you have anybody you interacted with that was surprised that you weren't a nurse or gave you flack for not being a nurse? Or was there any, instances that you ran into where you just didn't get the credit as an infection preventionist that you deserved because you didn't have the nursing background?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, this is a continuing conversation within our field as far as IPs that are non-nurses. So I will say, as I started out, thankfully, and I think that a part of the culture related to non-nurse IPs is also our predecessors. So if you're entering into a healthcare organization that previously had individuals that may, there was a mixture of individuals from certain backgrounds. Maybe they had a nurse and a medical technologist. So there was, from another profession. I think that it's kind of an easier transition within the role if those that came before you were not necessarily nurses, and or there wasn't the requirement for an extended period of time for the IP to be a nurse. So thankfully, I did not necessarily have to deal with any challenges per se related to that. Of course, in learning about IP, you do have to become acclimated to some critical components. However, they are teachable, and it doesn't, from my purview, require that you have the background of a nurse. But I have, navigated to other healthcare organizations within within the same health system as my initial IP opportunity. So in going to other health hospitals within that health system, some of the organizations, they've only had a nurse. So when I came in, I think that for anyone that's going into a role where historically they've only ever had nurses, I think that that's an opportunity for you to introduce yourself and set the playing field related to what you will bring to the organization. I think that from my experience, I let individuals know that, hey, this is my background. I'm a medical technologist, microbiologist by background. I am not a nurse. However, I'm here as a subject matter expert in infection prevention and control, board certified, and here to, be a resource to you within the organization. And I think that, from my experience, I did not receive any complications related to that, because I think that at least when you're coming into a role, whereas there's always been a nurse within the role, when you are someone who displays your knowledge and skills and you have some level of IP experience prior to that, people respect that. And also when you don't know something, you are very open and honest and transparent, and you get back to those individuals and to convene with your literature reviews and your research, and you're providing and consulting with your other IP colleagues as well, but you're providing comprehensive recommendations, and you're setting a tone to be a respected figure within the organization, and you work on that. I think that will assist with the transition into that particular role when there's historically been a nurse within the position.
Yeah, and kind of diving in further, how did you actually go about learning the clinical side that you didn't have experience with? Because I think the conversation very quickly just nationally shifts towards, can non-nurses do it? And I think things are turning in the right direction. We'll continue to work on that. But what about you actually learning the clinical piece? I mean, obviously, when you're a nurse, you're coming in, there's a whole aspect of the role that you're going to have to learn on the job. Coming in as a non-nurse, there's a clinical piece that you're going to have to learn. There's probably new terminology and stuff that you're dealing with. But how did you actually go about learning the things that you needed to learn in order to be an effective infection preventionist?
One of the strategies that I took to learn some of the clinical components of IP as a non-nurse is leveraging the skills and expertise of the individuals that I'm working with, right? So if, say for example, if I'm amongst a team of IPs and there isn't a nurse on that team, I will definitely partner with a nurse leader and or a bedside nurse and take the time to round with them. When it came to learning, say for example, central line and urinary catheter audits, I definitely rounded with the nurses and nurse educators to learn about these devices, these indwelling devices, and assess what are the aspects of, an audit that I need to ensure that I'm successfully executing. What are the things to look out for, even as it relates to the patient's symptomology and their condition. Really, this is not something that a profession that you can, I don't believe that you can, do it alone. Definitely build your network of individuals. And if you're a solo IP, reach out to other IPs at other organizations, leverage the expertise of the nurses that are there, the CNAs, and whomever that's willing to be a teacher. Handling it from the approach of displaying a questioning attitude, and not being the IP police or anything such as that. My position when during that time in which I was learning the clinical aspect, I was very open and willing to learn and understanding that this person is the expert related to this. However, I'm bringing, my knowledge as an infection preventionist to ensure that we're promoting patient safety. And this is something that we're doing in partnership. So I think that it's very integral to really partner with the clinical stakeholders, respiratory therapists and et cetera, to learn the clinical components and do literacy, conduct your literature reviews, read the articles in APIC, the peer-reviewed articles as well, in order to learn how best to navigate your role and the clinical aspects of it.
All right, let's talk about the role you were in. So your first infection prevention role, you mentioned there were non-nurses that came before you that kind of established that as a potential track. What did your role actually look like? Were you on a team? Were you by yourself? Who were you reporting to? Can you kind of give me the overall scope of what you were dealing with in your first role?
Absolutely. So as an infection preventionist, I have an amazing opportunity to work at 3 separate hospitals within the same health system. So at my first opportunity, there was 2 of us. So we, co-led the IPC program, and we had a director of IP that we reported to. And as noted, we matrix reported to the CMO. That second organization, it's a large healthcare organization in the Chicagoland area, a suburb just outside of Chicago, a level 1 trauma center, so it was a larger team. So there was 4 of us IPs. I was one of 4, and we had a manager, and then that manager reported to the director of IP. And then with it being a large system, there was a VP level level infection prevention leader within our health system.
Wow.
And then that third organization, I was the solo IP. So directly reported to a director of IP. However, within those, you matrix reported to the CNO. So from organization to organization, you have your matrices of who you report to within executive leadership.
And it looks like you spent about 4 years kind of in that staff level role in between 3 hospitals, like you mentioned. At what point did you decide you needed to get your certification? At what point did you decide you were ready to get your certification? Was that something you knew you wanted to do from day one, or was that something that was introduced to you later on? But just talk for a second about when you decided to take that step and why you feel that certification was important for you in your career.
So when I decided to take the certification, so I knew prior to entering into the field of IP that there was this CIC. Of course, I saw it on jobs, and I did my research related to the certification in infection control. In my first position, it was actually a requirement to secure your CIC certification within the first 2 years. So that, definitely wanting to operate within securing my CIC certification, but also, wanting to successfully complete the exam for my certification and secure it, because that is a badge of honor and a badge of me being a subject matter expert that I do wear proudly within the field of infection prevention. So yes, it was a requirement. However, I definitely, even if it wasn't a requirement, I would want to study and take the CIC certification.
So talk to me for a second about APIC. Obviously, you've been very involved with APIC, what looks like probably since early on in your infection prevention career. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious as to how instrumental APIC's been. You were given an award as a IP emerging leader. You're the host of the 5 Second Rule podcast, which is awesome. And everybody listening to this would be very interested in listening to that podcast as well. But I'm curious, when did you get involved with APIC? And then a couple questions here, I guess, is like, one, how do you find the time to do these like extracurricular things in such a demanding job to begin with? But two, just how good of an experience has that been for you?
APIC has been, APIC, of course, has been very integral within my career. Now, as far as how I find the time to do it, that's a challenge in and of itself. Just trying to balance everything because, of course, I'm not just a part of APIC. I'm a part of several other organizations, professional or, I am a part of a sorority as well, Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated. And also, I have 2 daughters that, and I pour into them and make sure that they're involved in activities and things that really enrich enrich the things that they're passionate about. So, it's work-life harmony is what I will say. There really isn't a balance. Is work-life harmony. What are some of the things? One question that I ask is, what is something that is important to me, or what is something that I'm passionate about? So, with the podcast, thankfully, I was able to have the opportunity to be the amazing opportunity, which is an honor to be the co-host of the 5 Second Rule podcast. And public speaking is something, in an odd way, because I consider myself an ambivert. I really love it. And it's something that, kind of like in the back of my mind wanted to do. So I'm saying that to say that, if there's something that you're passionate about, or if there's something that you want to learn more about, because this was my approach, leverage APIC, join your local chapter, get involved. I was on the education committee during the pandemic. So we facilitated the first virtual conference, and you just learn and navigate and really build relationships. And that's relationships with those individuals. We were all, and you build a community, which is very important. I built a community of individuals. We were all at our separate organizations in the Chicagoland area, battling the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we're coming together to try to bring people together because things have waned, of course, with all that was going on in the world. And you build levels of connection with individuals within the profession, which is very enriching.
And you're mentioning all these things. I mean, you've got all this stuff with APIC. You've got 2 daughters that you're taking care of. And then I'm also noticing you're working on a doctorate that looks like that's about to finish up. So I'm very impressed with how much you're able to tackle at once. But what inspired you or motivated you to go and get a doctorate degree on top of everything else you have going on in your life?
Absolutely. So, of course, in my mind, I do have a vision of what my career will subsequently be. And one of the, I'm pursuing my doctorate in health science, and this was something that even before I graduated with my master's in healthcare administration, I knew then that prior to that my path was to obtain my doctorate. One of the aspects of being an IP is that I really, really enjoy and love is the educational component, educating multidisciplinary teams, and the beauty of customizing your education, because it's not a one-size-fits-all model, right? You have to go based on andragogy, adult education, and really catering your messaging to your audience, and being strategic about that. So, and research is something that I want to learn how to advance the literature within my respective field. Therefore, I pursued am pursuing my doctorate in health science at the University of Indianapolis. And like I said, it's not, I won't lie to anyone and make it seem like, oh, it's just, I organize it so well and everything is so balanced. It's definitely not. It's work-life harmony. And it has come with several sacrifices in order to, navigate within these multiple initiatives and that multiple facets of operating within APIC and the different things that I do external to my job. It's really work-life harmony and me operating within my passion, doing the things that I feel, the things that I know I'm passionate about and the things that I believe will enrich me towards future endeavors.
And let me ask this. So, I mean, there's only about roughly 7,000 people that are certified in infection prevention in the United States. A very, very, very small portion of those have their doctorate. So I'm curious, is getting a doctorate something that has has it really made an impact on your day-to-day infection prevention career? Like, is it something you would recommend other infection preventionists seek out? Or is this more just kind of personal interest and want to have this in your back pocket?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I personally would not recommend or make the recommendation that, an IP should seek a doctorate. I think that pursuing a doctorate is a very personal experience considering where your career paths lie. Of course, many of the opportunities that are available to us healthcare professionals in the field of IP do not require a doctorate unless, maybe it's something that's heavily based in epidemiology and heavily research-based. There might be a PhD doctorate requirement. So, from my purview, pursuing your doctorate is a very, very personal experience. I will share that me pursuing my doctorate, it doesn't necessarily even have to do with my role as an infection preventionist. It more so has to do with what is my idea or my framework that my mental framework of where my career will progress. And so if your pathway into whatever it is that you intend to pursue or subsequently become within your career, it aligns with pursuing a doctorate, then, maybe that's the best approach for you. However, if you can navigate your career and not pursue a doctorate, those are decisions you would have to make and, consider which doctorate are you pursuing. For example, I know that there are doctoral programs in public health, and I'm not necessarily considering, a doctorate of public health. Mine is in health science. However, if your goal is to advance literature, pursue research, learn and understand the strategies in executing qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, et cetera, there are a plethora of options for you to consider.
Cool. Okay. Now, I want to get into this. You spent about 4 years as an infection preventionist, staff level. You make a jump after that to a system infection control manager. That makes a whole lot more sense having listened to you talk for the last 30 minutes. But how did you make that jump from staff level up to system manager? That's not the normal progression. It seems like you jumped over a couple steps in there. But how did you land that? How did you land that position? How did that happen for you?
Absolutely. So through tenacity and grit, I have at this point in time, well over 10 years of experience in healthcare overall, and I also have my master's in healthcare administration, and the reasoning behind pursuing such a master's level degree is, wanting to learn the inner workings of the healthcare system and leadership aspects of that and how to be successful within a leadership role. And so, of course, I knew that, in healthcare, my ultimate path would be in healthcare leadership. Now, what that would look like, of course, I didn't have that at the time of pursuing my master's degree, because I was still working as a medical technologist, didn't necessarily have that mapped out. However, I knew that that was a goal that I was working towards as far as my personal career path. So in pursuing that, it was through tenacity and grit. Depending on your geographic region, the opportunities for leadership level positions as far as the title goes, because I will preface that, of course, innately, we are as IPs are leaders without a title. Of course, that's
right.
Incorporated within our competency model. We are leaders. However, depending on the trajectory of your career, unfortunately, there is a barrier to seeking leadership roles if you don't have the title of a leader. And I will say that was more so my experience, is definitely wanting to pursue leadership roles because this aligns with my career path. Yeah, so leveraging my skills and expertise at the time as an infection preventionist in culmination with my educational background and having my master's in healthcare administration, I definitely, from my purview, there was a point whereas I knew that I was ready for my next opportunity. And it wasn't just me making a silo decision. It was also me conferring with my mentors, which I know that is absolutely key. I have mentors not only in the field of IP, but external to the, our profession as well in healthcare, garnering their insights, assessing, you don't want to move prematurely into a position. So also garnering the insights of those who you trust to assess whether or not, to assess the decisions that you're making within your profession.
Oh, very cool. And can you just quickly give the overall scope of that position? Just how big of a hospital? Did you have multiple people reporting to you? And I guess it's system, how many facilities?
So the scope of this role involves being the leader, the system infection control manager of 2 acute care hospitals in Chicago and 1 inpatient rehab hospital. So 3 organizations. And within our department, there are 3 infection preventionists.
Okay. And those all reported directly to you? Is that?
Yes. Those all 3 FTEs reported directly to me. Yes.
Okay. How was that transition just from being a staff level on the floor up to a manager? And was it the same? Were you still very much on the floor and very hands-on, or was this a different role entirely for you?
Yeah, so this was a very different role entirely, because you're transitioning from being an individual contributor to now being the leader of the department and being that conduit for strategic goals, right? And working more so on the system initiatives of the department, being a resource to your team, securing resources for your team, advocating for your team. And also being a conduit to enriching the staff within your department, really understanding and learning them as individuals and how can we subsequently work and partner to get them to where they desire to be. So it's multifaceted and it's very different and eye-opening from transitioning to being an individual contributor to being a healthcare leader.
Okay, a couple more questions for you because we're running out of time here, and I think I know what you're gonna say based on some of your answers so far. But I'm curious, in your opinion, what makes for a good IP? Meaning, are there certain personality traits that you think just fit really well? Are there certain just types of people, or is there anything specific that you can kind of spot in an individual and think, oh man, they would make a great IP if they just pursued this, or if they continued in the field, or what is it? But yeah, what, in your mind, what makes a good infection preventionist? What's a good makeup?
Yeah, so what makes a good IP is someone who definitely executes critical thinking within their daily workflows. But it's also someone, because I know, we have there's this notion that we are the police, right? And that notion came from somewhere based on how the role is executed. So definitely, as I noted previously, being someone who is coming as a partner and having that be your disposition. Yeah, so someone that will make a great IP is someone that can navigate various interdisciplinary groups. And it doesn't mean that you're someone who's extroverted or you're loud spoken or you're always the person to be at the front of the room. That's not necessarily true, but you are there to be a contributor, a positive contributor to the initiative working towards advancing patient safety and, the hospital metrics. You're also someone who, in my, from my purview, is someone that has a heightened sense of personal or self-ethics, right? It's that notion of doing what is right, even when no one is looking. We come across a lot of things within our profession, and we come across a lot of areas of opportunity. So being strategic about navigating that and presenting that to leadership with the subsequent goal of having it addressed for everyone's safety. Also, I think that being an avid learner to a certain degree is absolutely integral. We come across a myriad of situations, instances. We cover so many aspects of healthcare, and quite frankly, I will speak for myself. I'm not an expert at every single component that we touch. So it's being an avid learner, displaying a questioning attitude when you're engaging with staff, opposed to saying, "Well, I'm the expert." Really being engaging with the healthcare team to really seeking to understand their insights and ways in which there's potential barriers within their workflows that we can partner to improve, more so than, believing that any of the issues that we may identify is an individual issue. It's because of that person. We have to be process focused. So having someone that is process focused and assessing processes, of course, in rare instances, there might be an individual, situation that must be addressed. But moreover, focusing on the processes and being strategic and really being willing to learn, consistently being willing to learn and advance your knowledge in the IPC space.
Now, the last little section, I want to give you the chance to kind of speak to our audience. I mean, we tend to have a lot of people that are new into the profession or kind of curious about getting into the profession. So I'm curious if you have a message for anyone that's considering pursuing this field, just any sort of insight or encouragement you would give to those people, or people that are in it and not really sure if they want to stay in. Maybe they're getting burned out or overworked or whatever the complications are. But any sort of encouragement to those folks that are kind of newly engaged with infection prevention.
Yes. So words of encouragement for those that are seeking to transition to the field of IP. I would say this: don't fear rejection. And why do I say this? It took me years to get into the field of IP, from the time in which I initially began while working as a medical technologist, initially began applying for IP roles, to the point of me subsequently, being offered an IP opportunity. If there's no, and that's cross-translational to anything that it is that you're pursuing. Despite any of the rejections that you may receive in trying to navigate, pursuing roles within IP, be consistent. Display that heightened level of grit and tenacity, and always continue to pursue the profession. And from, my notion and my philosophy is that rejection is redirection for you to, further go along your path that you're intended to go along. Right. And then also learn while you're trying to navigate securing an IP role, continue to advance your knowledge. There are a plethora of webinars. APIC has a plethora of resources whereby you can learn some of the aspects of the work and the things that we as IPs are responsible for. Continue to research and prepare and get and obtain the knowledge, build your knowledge during this time while you're exploring opportunities in IP. But then also going back to relationship building, join APIC. Be involved in the APIC chapter, networking with you have individual contributors, but then you also have leaders, hiring manager, leaders that are a part of your local APIC chapter. That's a great way for you to network and potentially secure opportunities, but then also to learn more about the profession to assess whether or not it's even meant for you overall. One of the things that I recommend to individuals is conducting informational interviews with individuals that, albeit maybe you're interested in their position or for other reasons, conducting informational interviews. And if you're not acclimated with it, I would highly implore you to Google what that is and Google some questions for informational interviews. It's really something that I definitely applied, even in my pursuit of an IP position to learn about somewhat of the daily workflows of an IP and to learn more whether this opportunity would be a good fit for me. Now, as it relates to individuals that are in the IP space, and many of us are burnt out, a lot of us, we battled together during the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a lot, that some organizations, that a lot of things that we're responsible for, and understandably so. And I know that there's a lot of literature and research that has been disseminated and currently being studied about burnout and specifically IPs. And I would definitely implore you to assess your why, whatever that is professionally and even personally, you really tap into that and also tap into the resources that many IP professionals are disseminating related to burnout and ways that you can practice self-care to mitigate that. If IP is the profession that you're passionate about, evaluating how you can recalibrate things within your profession to quell that burnout would be my recommendation. And of course, IP, although we're talking about infection prevention roles, there are some ways in which you can kind of, quell that burnout by transcending into some other opportunities within the space of IP. Like, say, for example, if you wanted to be an infection prevention surveillance analyst or other opportunities within the space of IP, maybe working in the acute care setting is not something that you want to continue to pursue. I would just implore you to maybe do some additional research about other opportunities, but still within the profession if this is something that you're still passionate about.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Voice for Infection Prevention. We hope you found our discussions informative and insightful. Remember to subscribe to our podcast for more conversations with experts in the field, and don't forget to leave us a review to let us know what you think. For additional resources and to stay updated on the latest news in infection prevention, visit our website at voiceforip.com. Thank you again for listening. Until next time, stay safe and continue your commitment to excellence in infection prevention.